Here I'm using a profile view of Chucky to talk about the anatomy and function of the cerebellum. At the top is the cerebrum, the main part of the brain. The cerebellum is found underneath in the posterior cranial fossa part of the skull, located just behind the brainstem. If I take this and swap it out for a bigger one, you can see that it is made up of folia, meaning it has folds or wrinkles that help to increase the surface area. In the center is the arbor vitae, aka the tree of life. This is white matter and consists of tracts that bring sensory and motor information to and from the cerebellum. It is anatomically separated into 3 lobes, the anterior, posterior, and flocculonodular lobe. By unfolding the cerebellum, we can view it posteriorly to talk about its function. The main functions being balance, coordination of movement, and muscle tone. More specifically, the cerebellum is responsible for coordinating and refining complex movements. It is able to detect errors and correct them, so that a movement appears fluid and achieves its intended goals. The cerebellum also has a part to play in language processing, ocular movements, and episodic memory. The flocculonodular lobe deals primarily with vestibular movement, including visual input. Information travels from the inner ear via the vestibulocochlear nerve, or cranial nerve 8. Therefore, its functional name is vestibulocerebellum, and it is involved with body equilibrium and balance. Focusing up here, the cerebellum has 2 hemispheres, separated by the vermis, meaning worm in Latin. The vermis has outer layers called intermediate zones, or paravermal zones. It contains sensory homunculi, or little men, represented by Tommy, Phil, and Lil. They show us where each part of the body is processed. The vermis receive sensory information from the head, neck, and trunk, and the intermediate zones from the limbs. Both are involved with limb position, posture, touch, pressure, as well as eye movement. This area is known as the spinocerebellum because information is traveling from proprioceptors in the body through the spinal nerves to here. The lateral areas are called the cerebrocerebellum because they receive information from the cerebral cortex and are responsible for fine-tuning skillful movement, such as playing an instrument or walking on uneven ground without falling. Information about planning and doing, motor movement, travels from the pre- and primary cortex to the cerebellum so it can be perfected. Information about sensation travels from the primary and secondary somatosensory cortex, so we know how to make a decision. And lastly, information travels from the visual system, specifically objects that are moving in our vision. In brief, the spinocerebellum is responsible for tone, the vestibulocerebellum is responsible for balance, and the cerebrocerebellum for coordination. All outputs from the cerebellum originate from the deep cerebellar nuclei. This is the grey matter at the very centre. One way to remember the individual nuclei making up the deep cerebellar nuclei is don't eat greasy foods. D for dentate nucleus. This receives input from the lateral hemisphere, which received input from the cerebrum cortex for motor planning. E for emboliform nucleus, and G for globose nucleus. They collectively receive input from the vermis region, which received input from the spinal column for proprioceptive feedback and tone. And F is for vestigial nucleus. This receives input from the vestibulocerebellum, which receives information from the inner ear structures for balance. So, how do the nuclei interact with fibers coming in and out of the cerebellum? The answer? There is an intense circuitry using axons and cells that inhibit and release fibers to have total control and feedback. There are 3 layers surrounding the deep cerebellar nuclei: molecular layer, Purkinje layer, and granular. The inferior olive tract provides climbing fibers to the Purkinje cells and has various functions, including learning and timing movements and comparing intended with achieved movements. It gives off axons to stimulate both the deep cerebellar nuclei and the Purkinje fibers. The Purkinje fibers in turn release inhibitors. All other sensory pathways provide mossy fibers that stimulate the deep cerebellar nuclei and granular cells. These in turn pass through the Golgi cells and spread across the molecular layer to release inhibitory neurotransmitters. This is a delicate process, when functioning correctly, will result in the deep cerebellar nuclei being able to send out an action that is controlled and coordinated, allowing for motor learning and is known as neural sharpening. Neural sharpening is when the most important stimulus in that moment of time is taken care of, and every signal sent out of the cerebellum has a perfect plan for movement. Not too much and not too little. Now I'll pass you over to Kath, who will start us off on our journey through the lifespan with a focus on the cerebellum function and impact on daily life.